Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
I must take recourse to the words of the most gifted of all Stephanian prose stylists, Mukul Keshavan. Rukun has no interest in impressing others. This sounds impressive, but isn't. Because this freedom from human neediness isn't down to modesty or reticence or some karmic insight into the general Maya-ness of things. It is simpler than that. So simple that he can't take any credit for it. Rukun doesn't like people. It explains everything about him. This is why he lives in the hills. This is why he loved his dog Biscuit. Without reservations, he wasn't human. He loves Beethoven because Beethoven is dead, and his genius can be electronically reproduced without the agency of other people. It's why he deals in books. Books are forms of disembodied intelligence. They hold out the promise of profundity or pleasure without people attached.
It is not often that an author and his editor strike up a relationship that survives 40 years of epistolary exchanges and intellectual sparring. The strangely enduring and occasionally fractious friendship that developed between the famously outspoken historian Ramachandra Guha and his reticent editor Rukun Advani is the subject of his new literary memoir. It started in Delhi in the early 1980s when Guha was an unpublished PhD scholar and Advani a greenhorn editor with the Oxford University Press. It blossomed through the 1990s when Guha grew into a pioneering historian of the environment and of cricket while also writing his biography of Verrier Elwin. Over these years, Advani was Guha's most constant confidant, his most reliable reader. He encouraged him to craft and refine the literary style for which Guha became internationally known. 4 decades later, though he no longer publishes his books, Advani remains Guha's most trusted literary advisor. Yet they also disagree ferociously on politics, human nature, and the nature of their commitment to India. They usually make up because it just wouldn't do to allow such an odd relationship to die. In this episode of BIC Talks, built around letters and emails between an outgoing and occasionally combative scholar and a reclusive editor prone to private outbursts of savage sarcasm, Ramachandra Guha discusses his new book, The Cooking of Books, a literary memoir. This episode is adapted from an in-person event that took place at the BIC premises in early February 2024. And now, over to Ram.
For those of you who know my work, you'll immediately conclude at seeing this that this is the shortest book I've ever written. It's also the most personal. It's a book about my relationship with a person who's been the most important professional influence in my life. As I say in the book, that next only to a writer's romantic partner is his or her editor. And in my case, it's a relationship that has been sustained over 50 years, which is very unusual in the present world, where writers change their editors as often as they change their smartphones. I first saw Rukun 50 years ago when I entered St. Stephen's College as a freshman. He was then a third-year student. Our lives have intersected, interacted, been complementary to one another, and occasionally diverged, spectacularly diverged. We are also very different in our personalities. As this book is about him, so I won't be speaking much about me. But I'm combative, argumentative. I used to be too much on Twitter, a little less now. I still give too many Zoom interviews. I'm out there. Whereas he is, over the course of his life, he was shy to begin with, and he's become more and more reclusive. And he now lives on a remote hilltop in Kumaon from where he edits his books, and where he does not meet authors because he does not like meeting authors. The author-editor relationship, where it is sustained, there's been a fine film made recently in America about the relationship between the editor Robert Gottlieb and his author Robert Caro, who wrote a magnificent, still unfinished 5-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson. And it's a film about their relationship, their conversations, and surely also boozy lunches and many meetings. Rukun and I rarely meet. There was just a brief period in our professional career when we lived in the same city, when we would occasionally go and have lunch in Quality's restaurant in Delhi, have chana bhatura, which is a specialty of the place. But before that and after that, we lived in different cities. We communicate by letters. So this is an account of course, a professional relationship, a person who shaped my career, who made my books, which I'll talk about, but also a personal friendship conducted through correspondence. Not through boozy lunches, not through watching cricket matches, not even through phone conversations or WhatsApp messages, but long letters, to begin with handwritten, then typed, and thereafter an email. So yesterday and today, we exchanged about half a dozen letters on each side. Each letter was 3 or 4 paragraphs long. And I vaguely knew that this was an unusual kind of friendship. I had always known it was vital in my professional life. But that the tenor of the friendship was one that was almost old-fashioned, archaic, and yet something worth retrieving, came to me during the pandemic, when I could not travel. And before the pandemic, for the 2.5 decades before the pandemic, I would go to Delhi or to Ahmedabad or to London every few months and spend several weeks working in the archives. And now all the archives were close to me, and it so happened that in my cupboards, I had this personal archive of 40 years of correspondence, around which this book is structured. And I quote, as Vikram mentioned in his introduction, much more abundantly from his letters, because they are far more quotable than mine. And before I come to the letters, I'll give you a kind of outline of the contours of this friendship and what it has meant to our lives and what it tells us about the world of literature and the world of publishing, as it has evolved over the last 40 years. Now, Rukun and I are almost the same age. He was born 2.5 years before me. He was born in Lucknow, which was the capital, still is the capital of Uttar Pradesh. I was born in Dehradun, which then was also part of Uttar Pradesh. We grew up, shall we say, in the age of Jawaharlal Nehru, and we are growing old in the age of Narendra Modi. And we first saw each other, and I underline the phrase saw each other 50 years ago in 1974, when I entered St. Stephen's College as an undergrad. Now, in those days, St. Stephen's College was all male. So there was a hostel of 300 young boys and men. I was in the first year, Rukun Advani was in the third year. And those of you who have been to college, and particularly to a hostel, will recall the aura around the final year student. Of course, there were 2 years still to go. There were people in the MA too. So this was a third year batch, which included some really dazzling talents, whom one already knew would be people who would go far. So the cricketer Arun Lal, who played 16 test matches for India, was captain of the college cricket team. Chaupan Das Gupta was one of the college's best debaters. He was then a Marxist, and he argued the Marxist case with as much dexterity and finesse as he argues the Sanghi case now. There was Parajoy Guha Thakurta, who had the same sterling, upright, unimpeachable character then as he has now, and was really interested in investigative journalism. And there were many others I shall not mention. Later became ambassadors, chief secretaries, editors of newspapers, and so on. But by common consent, the 2 most brilliant third-year students in the college were Shashi Tharoor, whom all of you know about, and Rukun Advani, whom I'm making visible for the first time to most of you through this book. And even then, they were a study in contrast. Shashi was charming, handsome, likable, outgoing. In my first week in college, I was brought on to his election campaign to have him elected president of the college union. He was an even better debater than Chaupan Das Gupta. He ran the quiz club, and he was destined for stardom. Rukun, on the other hand, was a recluse. Shashi was a university topper in history in the first 2 years and was going to top in the third year. Rukun was a university topper in the first 2 years in English and was going to top in the third year. So if you think of the intersection of literature and history, which is what my career has been about, and what this talk is about, these were the 2 great shining stars, and they were utterly dissimilar. Rukun, as I describe in this book, only had time for people who read serious literature, Hardy, Foster, Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, and who listened to high classical Western music, not Johann Strauss, preferably Beethoven, but at least Mozart. And there were about a dozen people who fitted that bill. And I was, of course, excluded because at that stage, I did not listen to much music and I really preferred playing cricket to reading. And in those 3 years, because Rukun carried on for an MA, Shashi and some others left overseas. Rukun carried on for an MA. So in 3 years, we were in the same small, self-enclosed community of young men. My room was 50 yards from his. I would pass his room while going to the dining room on the way back. And he never exchanged a word with me. And I was too scared. He was contemptuous of me because he was a scholar. I was a cricketer. And not a particularly good cricketer at that. I batted number 11, was the 5th bowler and the worst fielder in the college team. If I was Arun Lal, he would have at least talked to me. And I was also badly dressed. And he was, I describe in the book the one time we came face to face, where he was wearing a dapper jacket. He was, he had a nicely manicured beard, and he was getting on his motorbike. And I was coming into college in stained, unironed whites from cricket practice. And I said, hello. And he gave me a look of utter disgust. Now, that was where we were in college. Now, Rukun graduated in 1977. The next year, he got a scholarship, and he was the first INLAC scholars to go to Cambridge, where he commenced a PhD on the non-fiction writings of E.M. Forster. And after that, he could have returned to his old job teaching English in St. Stephen's, but he was distinctly unenthusiastic about teaching bored and confused and not very literate undergraduates. So he joined the Oxford University Press instead. I finished St. Stephen's 2 years after him, whereas Rukun always got a first class first in his BA and his MA. I was a utterly middling student, a low second class in my MA and a medium second class in my BA. Now, there's a certain distinction, a great distinction in being a first class student, like Shashi Tharoor and Rukun Advani, and a certain, shall we say, frisson in being a third class student. But if you're right in the middle, you know that your life is not going anywhere, certainly not as a student of economics. And by that time, I had recognized my limitations as a cricketer too. And completely by happenstance, I was in Orissa doing some field work on behalf of the Delhi School of Economics. And a veterinary doctor in Orissa told me about a man called Verrier Elwin, whom he said was like you. He came from far away to work in these tribal highlands. And I went back to my university library, picked up Elwin's autobiography, which is an incredibly moving and delightfully written account of how an Oxford scholar became the leading student and spokesman for India's Adivasis, and decided maybe I have a chance doing sociology and history, and my old university would not give me admission, but IIM Calcutta had a small, obscure, unknown, unrecognized, unhonored program where they had one slot, which I got. So I go there in 1980, and in night I'm doing my PhD on forest protest movements in the Himalaya, ending with the Chipko movement, partly because I had grown up in Dehradun. The first years of my PhD in Calcutta, 80 to 82, Rukun was in the last years of his PhD in Cambridge, two very different places in terms of prestige. I don't believe we thought of each other. Till in July of 1982, a common friend of ours was getting married in Delhi. This was K. Sivaramakrishnan, now a distinguished professor of anthropology at Yale, who was my classmate, my close friend, and we had a shared interest in cricket and in Hindi film songs. Rukun and he discussed books, and they both came from Lucknow. And they had both studied at the La Martiniere School in Lucknow, a place known for jocks, not for scholars. And I joke in my book that Rukun and Shivi became friends because they were two of only three people known to use the La Martiniere library in that time, the third being the future novelist Alan Seeley. So Rukun and Shivi had a friendship born out of a love of serious literature and classical music and a shared boyhood in Lucknow. Shivi was my undergraduate buddy whom I went with for test matches and so on. And he was getting married at the IIC in their Rose Garden. And the guests were all Shivi's parents' friends and his wife Bala's parents' friends. And I wish the couple came away and wondered what to do. There was no one else I recognized. Rukun was standing about 20 feet away from me, wondering the same thing. He said, Mehnai, I've come, I've wished Shivi, should I stay for dinner or should I push off? When you're young, free wedding dinner is something you think you should stay on for, particularly in those pre-liberalization days. So he was staying on, and I went up to him and I introduced myself and we started chatting. And he asked me what I had been doing. And I said, with great excitement, that I started a PhD in Kolkata and working on the Chipko movement. Rukun later wrote about this encounter in an essay, which he published in Outlook magazine. He said there that as the conversation proceeded, he said, your work seems interesting, and why don't you come to the offices of the Oxford University Press to discuss it further? Now, he said in the essay he wrote many years later that he only invited me out of curiosity. He says there, I tried to quote it from memory, he said, how did this man, whom I recalled as a failed reincarnation of Erapalli Prasanna, a weak reincarnation of Erapalli Prasanna, come to writing about village women hugging tree trunks? Had the failure to make the Indian cricket team bowled him clean out of his mind? Now, that is, kind of typical facetious humor that is Rukun's signature. I think he was, of course, curious, surprised, but also intrigued. He recognized that environmental history was a coming field, people were not working on it, and maybe this guy had something to communicate. I went across to his office, we chatted, I told him about my work. He said, send me your thesis. And in those days, we were talking about the days when I would write by hand and a typist would type it up. And among the few things I have in common with Mahatma Gandhi is a disastrous handwriting. So it went through a few drafts, and then finally it was cleaned up. And one of the stories about these various iterations, which I like telling, was there was a deputy commissioner in Garhwal in the British period who I had regularly quoted in my book because he was talking about peasants and the need to control them and manage them and curb their rebellious instincts. And his name was MacNair, who's a Scotsman called MacNair. The Scots, by the way, were devoted servants of the empire. And my typist, being a South Indian, everywhere made MacNair into MC Nair. Now, anyway, finally, all this was cleaned up. And it was a beautifully bound, the old days, a typed thesis bound in, black, hardbound with gold lettering, the title and gold lettering, not unpublished dissertation submitted for the award of, not the nonsense you find on the kind of completely dehumanized, soulless, anodyne stuff you find on internet. Go see my thesis on the internet. So I sent it to Rukun. I posted it, and he had a look at it and said, there may be a book in here. Now, at that stage, I had no clue I would ever write a single book. I had been a failed cricketer, a failed economist. Somehow I had discovered sociology. I stumbled upon environmental history, which was then an underdeveloped field. I was writing the first serious study of forests in the Himalaya, ending with the Chipko movement. I thought I'll get 2 or 3 articles about it. I'll publish something in the EPW, something in some other scholarly journal, and that's it. So I had no clue that I could actually have a book. Rukun had a look at it, gave me 6 or 7 pages of detailed comments, some of which are quoted in my book, and I published my first book, which is called The Unquiet Woods, which was first published by Oxford University Press and is still in print 35 years later under the imprint Rukun Advani now runs called Permanent Black, which I'll talk about a little later. So we then started a professional relationship, which became also a personal friendship because The Unquiet Woods was published in 1989. At that year, I moved to Delhi to take up a job, and Rukun was also in Delhi. So those were the years, again recounted in this book, where we would have extended conversations and so on. As I said, my move to scholarship was the product of happenstance, meeting an Odia veterinarian who told me about Verrier Elwin. Over the years, doing my PhD, I got increasingly fascinated with Verrier Elwin because he'd worked on forests, I was working on forests. I got interested in Gandhi, and I found that he had been an intimate of the Sabarmati ashram, and then I later quarreled with Gandhi about the question of celibacy and alcohol, on both of which I was on Elwin's side. So I decided I must pay my dues to this man who changed my life by writing a book about him. So I embarked on what was to become Savaging the Civilized, my biography of Elwin, which went through 7 drafts. It went through, I write usually quite quickly and easily. My Elwin book went through more drafts than any other book of mine except this. We went through even more drafts. But the reason the Elwin book was so difficult to craft was because a biography is one of the most difficult of literary genres. I was trained as a sociologist. Sociologists write about structure, class relations, the role of technology, the role of the state, the importance of the law. They write about aggregate social forces. Then I became a historian. Historians write about process, how things are changing. But a biographer writes about a personality. He has to enter his subjects' moods, emotions, thoughts, not unspoken thoughts, because a biographer is an artist under oath. He's not a novelist. He has to talk about relationships, personal relationships, romantic relationships, intellectual relationships, rivalries, enmities, and at the same time, set his subject's life against a wider historical and social canvas. I have now many years of experience in writing biographies, but at that stage, I found it more difficult than anything I'd done. And it was Rukun who took me through that process, and there are letters in this book about how he did so. And I'll just give you two illustrations that speak to how arduous I found it in writing my Elwin biography. So by third or fourth draft, I was reasonably satisfied. I sent it to Rukun. It came back with comments marked in green ink, specific comments, changing a phrase, asking me to look at this reference, alerting me to a poem which was similar to something Elwin had written. And then there was a kind of a summation of his general thoughts on the manuscript. And this summation ended with, "This is fine as a study of Elwin, the scholar and the public intellectual, but where is the human being?" So I said, I must bring in the human being. I went back to my notes. I went back to the archives. I read Elwin's letters to his mother, to his sister, to his friends all over again. And I brought in much more about Elwin's complicated relationship with his mother. He actually came to India partly to flee his mother, and he kept in touch with her, remotely through correspondence, the way Rukun does not want to see me, but is still willing to write to me from a long distance away. But also Elwin had married twice to tribal women. And the first marriage ended in a disaster. Second marriage was somewhat more successful. He had ferocious intellectual rivalry. His ideas on Adivasi culture were deeply controversial and frequently contested by Indian scholars. So I brought all that in. His relationship with his mother, his sister, his two marriages, one terribly tormented, the other reasonably harmonious, his intellectual animosities, and I wrote that all in from my sources into draft number 5. Which I sent to Rukun, and this came back a few weeks later, again with some many specific comments on style, on language, on phrasing, on structure. And finally, the magisterial remark, "This is fine as a study of Elwin, the son, the husband, the friend, but where is Elwin the scholar?" So I went back and wrote it all up, and finally, draft 6 or 7 was published, and actually, effectively, it was Rukun who made me a biographer. Without his I hesitate to say teaching, but without his nudging, without his focused and rigorous repeated readings, critical readings of my book, I would never have had the courage to take on a subject as complex as Gandhi. Now, Rukun made me a published historian. He made me a published biographer. He also introduced me to a third dimension of my work, which I would have never have thought of. And I'm going to read you a letter of Rukun's, written to me in 1988. So as I said, I was a sportsman, he was a scholar. The more I became a scholar, the more I wanted to disavow my sporting past because I was embarrassed. So in 1988, I came back from Yale, where my wife and I were, settled in Bangalore. I wrote Rukun a letter saying, "I have resumed playing cricket again with a first division club here, even though I realize that places our friendship at peril. You may regress to viewing me as a college cricket type instead of an up-and-coming sociologist." And promptly the letter came back, in those days handwritten, 2 days later from Delhi. It said, "Now that you've regressed to cricket," this is Rukun writing, "now that you've regressed to cricket and aren't likely to chuck over sociology, why don't you write us a sociology of Indian cricket? I don't think anyone's written such a book, whereas that area should, in your case, kill two interests with one stone, so to speak. There must be several very interesting sociological themes to explore, the game being so fundamental to Indian life. Has anyone explored the cultural and historical reasons for the game's hegemonic hold over practically every Indian class, the social backgrounds of our cricketers? This must have changed considerably with commercialization and professionalism, the social psychology of the Indian cricketing audience, the politics of Indian cricket, and no doubt many other questions that you would be able to think of. I hope you'll consider this seriously, if not as an immediate project, then at least something you'll think about and gather material. Now, this letter was written to me in 1987. 15 years later, I published my book, A Corner of a Foreign Field, which is, I suppose, not just the result of this thought planted in my mind by Rukun, but also many subsequent conversations with him about writing and including about sport. Actually, about this last thing about sport, to illustrate how different Rukun and I are as personalities. When I was young, I played cricket. I was obsessed with cricket. For 10 years, all I did was play cricket. You know, in St. Stephen's, we played 50, 60 matches a year. And in school and later with a club. And cricket is a sociable, gregarious sport, much more than any other. Football is also a team sport, but the fullback is never in conversation with the center forward. The pace of the game is too fast. At cricket, you're at first slip, you chat to the wicketkeeper. Overstrain, you put your hand over your friend who's bowling. A wicket falls, and then you're in the dressing room chatting, right? Now, so I played cricket. Rukun also liked one particular sport a lot, which was golf, which you can play alone. Anyway, so that's what Rukun has meant to me professionally. He made me a historian, a sociologist, a biographer, and a cricket writer. What makes Rukun a great editor, and there are many examples in this book, which I won't read out, is that he understands language and he understands thought. You have editors who are very good at cleaning up your prose. But there are very few editors, and none I know, and I work with editors all over the world, who have a PhD from Cambridge and can understand thought, and who have worked with some of the finest sociologists and historians who have ever written on India, both Indian and foreign. And I think that's what really makes him a great editor, as I hope you'll see from some of the things written in this book. Now, I published my first book with Rukun in 1989. For the next decade, I had a very close professional and personal relationship with him, which was also a close and professional relationship with his publisher, the Oxford University Press, which was then at the height of its fame and its glory. The OUP in India in the decades of the 80s and 90s was transforming the landscape of Indian scholarship. Much of what we understand about this society, its history, its politics, its culture, its sociology, is a result of the authors published by the OUP in the 80s and the 90s. I'll give you a few names. Robina Thapar, Veena Das, M.N. Srinivas, Andre Bete, Jean Drez, Amartya Sen, Thomas Troutman, Richard Eaton, the whole subaltern studies school, Partho Chatterjee, David Hardiman, Ramachandra Guha. And the OUP was like a home, second home for me. It had offices everywhere. It had first-rate and capable staff. And then in the late 90s, the OUP entered a steady, and now it appears, irreversible decline, which I speak about in this book, partly structural, to do with Thatcherite compulsions. The bottom line became more important than high-quality scholarship, which should not be the case for a university press, and partly the result of a managing director of OUP India who was insecure about the fact that his reclusive, shy editor was regarded in greater regard by his authors than him. And so I described all of it in the book and the ugly situation. By then, Rukun was married to Anuradha Roy, who's now a well-known novelist, but at that stage was a young editor, extremely good, almost as competent as Rukun, and with a much more winning personality, I should add. And they were forced to leave the OUP. And they set up their own publishing house called Permanent Black, which Rukun first said, because there was also an element of colonialist discrimination in how they were removed. Talked about this book. Rukun said he wanted to call it Kalu for men, since there was already a publishing house called Kali for women. He was not so spoofy to do that, but he did register his company on All Fools' Day, 1st April, which surely was not a coincidence. Okay, so he started this publishing house called Permanent Black, and the second book they published was one of mine. It's called An Anthropologist Among the Marxists and Other Essays. And in fact, I owe my subsequent life as an essayist also to the experience of working with Rukun Advani. Now, I no longer, it's many, many years since I published a book with Rukun, because as I say in a footnote to this book, Permanent Black is first class in editing, but third class in marketing and sales. And by now, I don't really need the kind of hand-holding editor that Rukun was, and I mostly can write my own books, except for this one, which, because it's so personal, it required many revisions and iterations from close friends. So I started publishing with trade presses, with not niche academic presses. But Rukun remains my closest literary confidant. Even in my journalistic work, which he is still the first person I go to for comments and how he reshapes. There are two examples I'll give you right here. I wrote a long essay called The Rise and Fall of the Bilingual Intellectual. which I'm very proud of because it was published in the Economic and Political Weekly, and later in my collection, Patriots and Partisans. It identified a particular literary phenomenon and its decline. India once had many bilingual intellectuals, people who wrote in Kannada and English, Bengali and English, Marathi and English. And over the decades, there'd been a separation of discourses with people like me and Shashi Tharoor and Amitav Ghosh and Mukul Keshavan and Arundhati Roy writing only in English and others writing only in Kannada or Malayalam. Which was not the case with the earlier generation. So Mahashweta Devi could write in English as well as Bangla. Girish Karnad could write in English as well as Kannada. So I wrote this essay, which I'm quite proud of. But when I sent Rukun a draft of the essay, it came back with 16 numbered paragraphs, each containing a deep sociological insight. And I've reproduced that whole letter there. Because as I said, it should really have been a co-authored essay. The second example, also in this book, is about an article I wrote in 2013, anticipating Narendra Modi's authoritarian impulses as and when he became Prime Minister. And that too, at least 2 paragraphs of that essay were, as I say in a letter to Rukun, Guha masquerading as Advani. I would like to read out some examples of Rukun's satirical prose from his private letters. So I'm going to read out 2 with your permission. One of the differences between Rukun and me is that I'm a patriot and he's a skeptic. I would like to think that somehow, somewhere, we can recover our original idea of India. And he thinks, following E.M. Foster, that nationalism is humbug, a pretense to confuse people, and what really matters are friendships. In 2010, there was the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, which was a wonderful archive, had been taken over by some Sonia Gandhi stooges, Gandhi family stooges, who had destroyed a very well-run historical archive. And they produced a calendar, which ran from 1st April to 31st March, a bird calendar on glossy paper, at a time when what the archive needed was money from microfilm machines. So I wrote an anguished letter to someone I knew in the governing body. And I copied Rukun, who wrote back, Ram, hi. I too got this wonderful NMML calendar. I don't know why you are so critical of it. I love it for its appropriateness. Surely you can see that it is the only calendar in the world which starts with 1st April. Such an auspicious day for the dispensation running the NMML. So heartwarmingly self-deprecating of them to alert us to the fact of all fools. Such a nice thumb-nosing of Oxford's All Souls. To think of printing a calendar which begins in the middle of the year is breathtakingly imaginative. Only an Indian Babu of the highest pedigree could have thought of this. It can set a wonderful precedent for Babudom generally and be sent off to all ministries as a reminder that the Christian era is passé. The BJP will love it. Others who have to learn to move with the times will learn that a year isn't a year unless it is seen as a financial year. Future editions of this work of brilliance can show January in red, February in orange, and March in green to remind Babus to rush forward and spend their budget. I'm in a tizzy thinking of all the many possibilities opened up by this calendar. A visionary new direction has been given to the institution. You are wrong to cavil it. I'll read out one more excerpt. This has to do with Rukun's explicitly elitist view of publishing. After he retreated to Ranikhet, he would occasionally come to Delhi. Now he doesn't at all. And shortly before the pandemic, I introduced him to a young publisher who had come from London, who was a very capable, bright person. And they had lunch and they hit it off. And inevitably, it resulted, the aftermath was disappointment. So a few weeks after our meeting in Delhi, Rukun wrote me this letter from Ranikhet about the publisher I had introduced him to. The young publisher, your friend, the young publisher, has written a surprisingly stupid review in Outlook praising Chetan Bhagat. Your friend seems to think that anything that sells 1 million copies must have value. Whereas no one would have noticed any value in Bhagat if he'd sold only 5,000. I think your friend has got the wrong end of the stick totally. First, because Bhagat is an extension of the magazine buying culture of this country, where 95 bucks seems worth blowing up if a herd of fellow nerds is blowing it up too, and you don't want to seem left behind by the Joneses. Second, 1 million fools buying Bhagat, like the millions of Indian males who piss in full view, only suggests that civilizationally the vulgar middle class's domination of India is absolute, to the extent of beguiling this otherwise sharp individual. Publishers become suddenly amenable to jettisoning standards when they think of the effect of 1,000,000 copies on their own publishing program. I'm almost grateful for being stuck bang in the middle of unreadable elites whose books sell only a few copies. At least there is no pressure on me to compromise by singing hosannas to Bhagat or Shobha. Now, as I said, he was always shy and reclusive, and I described the process where even in the OUP, he would not take his authors out for lunches, except oddities like me, because I was so different from him that once we stuck up a friendship, and despite our many disagreements which are in this book, we have carried on, probably because we don't live in the same town, we never see each other. So my book ends with the last time I saw him, which was just before the pandemic. And it was April of 2019. He lives in Ranikhet with Anuradha Roy. And Anu comes for literary festivals. He was in Calcutta last week, and he goes and speaks about her novels. But he never leaves. Virtually never leaves. He once went on a long pilgrimage to Vienna to pay homage to Beethoven, which is described in this book. And there also there's some lovely letters about what Beethoven meant to him. And he talks about going to Beethoven's grave. And he says, I left a 1 rupee coin on his grave so that he would know I was a Sindhi, that a Sindhi had come to worship. Now, which is kind of self-deprecating humor. But anyway, so I went in 2019. I was in Nainital, where I was staying with my friend, the great historian Shekhar Pathak. Were a few people Rukun still willing to meet. And I was going from Nainital to Kausani on a research trip. Now, those of you who know Kumaon would know that from Nainital, you would have to drive more or less via Ranikhet to Kausani. So I told Rukun I'm coming, and he said, come and have lunch. So the previous day, I was with Shekhar Pathak, and who's an extraordinary, brilliant, deeply humane, and extraordinarily widely traveled scholar. Anyone interested to read his great book on the Chipko movement, now out in English. And Shekhar was talking about Rukun and seeing him last time. And he said this phrase in Hindi about visiting Rukun in his den in Ranikhet. He said, Jitna Rukun chup hai, utna uska kutta bhonkta hai. So it's kind of made me just want to go. So we went. I took this on my way to Kausani. I went, had lunch with him. And Anu was there, and so was our old OEP friend Rivka. And we went to a nearby hotel for lunch with a view of the snows. And he drove me back to my cab, which is going to take me to Kausani. And he said, I wish you'd stayed longer. And at that stage, I wished too. But as soon as I got into the car, and in 10 minutes, I realized that I'd done just the right thing. I'd seen he was happy in his reclusiveness, but to stay anymore would have been an imposition. Now, I began with St. Stephen's College, and I'm going to end with St. Stephen's College and Shashi Tharoor. There's a letter written to me. There are many letters written to me by Rukun in which Shashi figures. And I've quoted only one in this book. And the case of some other letters, like the publisher I mentioned, I've redacted names, but not here because Shashi is a public figure. And I felt it was appropriate that. But I'm not going to read you that letter that Rukun has written about Shashi. I'm instead going to read you why they are so different. Shashi Tharoor and Rukun Advani, a Stephanian Rukun was ambivalent about towards his classmate Shashi Tharoor. Both ranked first in their batch, Tharoor in history, Advani in English, but there the resemblance ended. Shashi was, even in college, very much a public man, debating, acting, becoming president of the Woodhouse Society and of the Quiz Club before being elected president of the college union. He was charming and outgoing, but from the start, ferociously ambitious. Shashi wanted to make a mark in the world quicker and more dramatically than any Stephanian or perhaps any Indian before him. Whereas Rukun had no ambitions to become well known, in college, all he wanted to do was read, listen to music, and have one-on-one conversations with friends. In the OUP, all he wanted to do was edit books. While he gloried in the success of his authors, he never remotely wanted to take any credit for this. As we have seen, this inwardness and reclusiveness deepened even further when he retreated to Ranikhet and ran permanent black from there. Then I quote Rukun's letter to Shashi. I'll just read out 2 paragraphs. As I have said, Shashi and Rukun were contemporaries in St. Stephen's. Superficially, they were alike. Both brilliant, both very widely read, each far removed in his interests From the sports type I myself was in college. Even some of their literary tastes overlapped. Both admired Woodhouse and Orwell, for example. Yet in terms of character and personality, no two Stephanians could be so radically dissimilar. I suspect most readers of this book will know Shashi Tharoor's public profile. To show how Rukun Advani is, as it were, his absolute other, I must take recourse to the words of the most gifted of all Stephanian prose stylists, Mukul Keshavan. And here a quote from Mukul Keshavan follows. Rukun has no interest in impressing others. This sounds impressive, but isn't. Because this freedom from human neediness isn't down to modesty or reticence or some karmic insight into the general Maya-ness of things. It is simpler than that. So simple that he can't take any credit for it. Rukun doesn't like people. It explains everything about him. This is why he lives in the hills. This is why he loved his dog Biscuit. Without reservations, he wasn't human. He loves Beethoven because Beethoven is dead, and his genius can be electronically reproduced without the agency of other people. It's why he deals in books. Books are forms of disembodied intelligence. They hold out the promise of profundity or pleasure without people attached. Thank you.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.